Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Kambi Zranavardi, board member for ColumbiaDC and a graduate of the School of Engineering and Applied Science. First, let me thank our partners, Harvard Club of Washington, D.C., and the members for joining us this evening. We are very privileged and honored to have Leon Fink, distinguished professor in the Department of History at the University of Illinois, Chicago, talk about undoing the liberal world order, progressive ideals and political realities since World War II, which is the topic of his most recent book published by Columbia University Press. This would be in conversation with Adam B. Kushner, education editor of Washington Post. I would like to encourage everyone to check our website for the full bios and also link for the book if you like to purchase it. But please allow me to briefly introduce our speakers. Leon Fink is distinguished professor of history emeritus at the University of Illinois at Chicago and senior resident scholar at Georgetown University's Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and Working Poor. He's the editor of the journal Labor, Studies in Working Class History of the Americas, and his many books include Labor Justice Across the Americas, published in 2017, and of course, the topic of today's discussion, which is his most recent book. Our host, Adam B. Kushner, is the education editor of Washington Post, running papers coverage of national education trends, universities, and school districts in the DMV area. Previously, he was the editor of Post's Outlook, its home for ideas, essays, arguments, and book criticism coverage that won a Pulitzer Prize in 2019 under his leadership. Before that, he was the editor of National Journal magazine, a senior editor for Foreign Affairs at Newsweek, and a managing editor at the New Republic. Adam has a BA in the study of antiquity from Columbia University. Without further ado, please take it away, Adam.
Thank you so much, Kambis. Thanks to all of you for coming. And Leon, thank you for doing this. Undoing the liberal world order is extremely apropos. A lot of what you've written in this very engaging book is about how American liberals harness their views to do some very good things abroad in the 20th century, from building the international financial system at Bretton Woods to guiding the sanctions regime that helped end South African apartheid. But the subtitle of your book is Progressive Ideals and Political Realities Since World War II. So maybe you might start us off by talking a bit about some of those realities and where, in your view, liberalism came up short.
Sure, and thank you. I'm delighted to join the distinguished Adam Kushner, and thanks for the intro from Cadiz and this invite from the Columbia and Harvard Alumni Associations. I'd just like to say first, I think it's quite appropriate. This is a really appropriate audience because American foreign policy was basically run by Ivy League graduates for decades. And those include some of the main characters in my book, including Adolph Burley, who matriculated at Harvard at age 14 and went on to become a key brain truster for FDR in Latin America. John Kenneth Galbraith, of course, who taught JFK and then joined his White House and reported to his diary about meals in the White House basement that conversation is much like that at the Harvard Faculty Club, perhaps because it involves the same people. But my favorite of these Ivy League graduates was Chester Bowles, ambassador to India, who recalled his Yale years as a period of overwork, confusion, and missed opportunities. It was unfashionable in or out of college to think much about anything. I'm sure that doesn't apply to most of those in the audience, but in any case, Adam, I'm happy to turn to your question about the main thrust of my book. I sort of am drawn both to the idealism of these liberal foreign policy gurus, their commitment to democracy, prosperity, and freedom on the one hand, but also the frustrations that they encountered along the way. And I find that among the major stumbling blocks was a kind of instinctive anti-communism that tripped them up, especially in the third world, and allowed them to miss some of the complexities of nationalism in dealing ultimately with the tragedy of Vietnam, kind of most saliently, but then also challenges about the notion of development, economic development, that was crucial in places like India, where they found hard to move from textbook models to the real world. Even the question of respect for national self-determination, which was a bedrock of liberal faith, really going back to Woodrow Wilson and really to the present, continues to be a complicated question, which they encountered ultimately, perhaps most dramatically in the Middle East, with the question of ultimately when both Israelis and Palestinians claim the same land as their homeland. So there's plenty that absorbed me, and I think remains resonant issues to the present in dealing with these issues of liberals and foreign policy.
And a big focus of the book is where some of these some of these endeavors came up a little short. You also have a lot on the achievements of American liberalism, and maybe you could just talk us through some of the, I don't know if you would consider them insufficiently heralded, but some of the chapters you have where there were successes.
Sure, thanks. I begin with the architecture for the post-war world, which I don't think is sufficiently credited to the liberals, but basically the whole Bretton Woods agreement that rescued the world from kind of autarkic economic fiefdoms in the pre-World War II era, to creating a kind of mutualist, more open world economic system that involved institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, and attempted to create more comedy, more positive interrelationships among nations. That turned out to be a complicated proposition, but I think it was a major achievement, which we also associate with the Marshall Plan and the recovery of much of war-torn Europe. Second, the recovery of West Germany, not just as a viable state, not just as a buoyant economy, but as a democratic bulwark in Europe. And I particularly focus on the restoration of labor rights and a kind of a buoyant what the Germans call social partnership economy that developed right out from under the occupying powers, particularly the British and the Americans, who helped to nurture institutions like co-determination at the workplace, where workers and their employers regularly get together still to this day to determine and make important decisions. That came out of these liberal policymakers and activists in this period. And I think also I give a lot of credit to liberals for the helping to nurture the state of Israel. They were its firmest backers. The State Department itself was skeptical and even hostile. People like Emanuel Seller, people like Eleanor Roosevelt, Frida Kirchway of The Nation. These were some of Israel's staunchest American friends. When we turn to Central America or India, or and ultimately, it's more complicated, but ultimately the book ends, I tried to end on a triumphant note, which is really turning to the issue of South Africa and ultimately the sanctions that a liberal Congress combined with a vigorous grassroots movement of liberals and self-proclaimed radicals, particularly from the African-American community, achieved in passing severe sanctions against the apartheid regime in South Africa. And that bill in 1986 helped to undo the apartheid state and ultimately led to the election of Nelson Mandela a few years later. So I think the liberals had much on their platter, and they had several major accomplishments.
One theme that I think is really interesting that's sort of lurking in the background of the book is the idea that of the Soviet threat as a force driving the American liberal impetus to fight world hunger and mass poverty and other problems of inequality. You also point today to a quote, loss of any transformative social engineering agenda among progressives. I'm wondering if you think without an enemy, is liberalism's reach abroad much circumscribed?
Well, I think it's an interesting question as to what happened to the missionary sense of liberalism from this period. I don't think it exists today in that form, and we can see that in the kind of grappling, even of the Biden administration, and trying to herd the cats of democratic countries together for exactly who knows what. I think it's kind of vague and much comparatively imprecise. But I do think that the Soviet challenge concentrated the minds of these people, many of whom were these liberals. I'm talking about the people in the democratic administrations of the post-war years. Many of them were looking for alternatives to communism, but were also insistent that they create a framework that was basically liberal and tolerant on race, that was social welfarist in creating a distributive economy that protected rights of free speech and expression. These are all fundamental liberal premises that help to drive policy.
You talked a little bit about in the book, the ad hoc nature of the left's response to security challenges, which I thought was an apt description. The left here in the last decade or so has steered much more into questions of identity politics as some of the sort of core interests, at least of one wing of the Democratic Party. Part of this, I think, is inevitable because it comes from the battles for civil rights on behalf of LGBT people and against structural racism. I'm wondering if you think there is a certain cost for the left's more traditional focus on economic issues in this pivot, or even if you agree there's a pivot, do you think the Democrats are focused on the right things domestically?
Well, my focus, of course, here is on their focus in not domestically, but in foreign policy. And I see them as having lost a sense, I think domestically, they're supercharged on maybe running in contrary and even contradictory directions domestically, but they don't lack for energy. But they do lack for energy in foreign policy. There's precious little said about foreign policy throughout the primaries of 2020. There's yet to be any clear enunciation, except when it comes to big power or major security issues. But you could hardly point to any vision of foreign policy among liberals, and I'd say this goes back to really the Clinton years and then the Obama years, as well, into Biden. There's just not a clear direction, and I think that part of the problem is a matter of economics, that on foreign policy, beginning with Clinton, the U.S. largely aligned itself with a hands-off or a policy towards economic development, relying on market mechanisms. This is often called neoliberalism, and it lost any sense of any coordinated economic program of development or an attempt to rely on anything else for world equity and kind of standard of living other than the marketplace. So I think there was a letdown of liberal imagination in that respect. Otherwise, I think we also, when we talk about foreign policy, it's almost always from the top down now, and there's very little connection to connections among people. We once had the Peace Corps. We once had when the post-war allies were allies with close connections. The labor movements worked together. Other civics associations work together. We see relatively little of that today.
Yeah, my question was sort of trying to, to figure out what's your theory of the case for why Democrats and liberals are looking outward a little bit less. I mean, it sounds like you think the answer is not because of identity politics issues, but maybe because of a reliance. I mean, you sort of suggested that maybe the turn toward neoliberalism and market-oriented solutions has something to do with this. Maybe you can elaborate on that.
Yeah, so where could we start? I'd see that the issues that liberals in recent decades have turned to have been matters of individual human rights problems, disaster responses to catastrophes like the Balkans, but very little planning for. I mean, let's go back to the Bretton Woods, where there was an attempt to build up strong democracies, domestic institutions, economic development, and I see relatively little of that. And in its place, it seems like there's been a retreat to both just dealing with emergencies, but no larger visions or programs.
Mm-hmm. Talking a little bit about, what some of the things the Bretton Woods Agreement was endeavoring to erect. It must be strange to witness not only the rise of people like Viktor Orban and Jair Bolsonaro and Sebastian Kurz and Rodrigo Duterte, but also, a U.S. presidential administration's sometimes very close relations with them. I'm wondering if you think what's happening abroad right now is sort of a blip or something cyclical, or are we witnessing maybe a more secular global trend toward anti-liberal authoritarianism that American liberals are not really engaged with?
It's clearly tied to a crisis in our own democracy at home, an illiberalism that I think is partly bred from an inability to deliver the goods to ordinary people at home or abroad. And I think that as basically beginning in the 1970s, the world economic production, consumption became much more globalized, interconnected. National parties found it very hard to solve national problems because the problems themselves were often rooted beyond the nation. Take the problem of job loss in this country going back to developments like NAFTA and the movement of jobs out of the country, of our manufacturing base. Well, that couldn't be solved easily by an act of Congress internally. Just as once the mechanisms of the economy superseded in important ways national borders, then what were the alternatives? And I think in the absence of nations being able to address their own problems adequately, there's been a loss of confidence in democracy at the national level, and that's led to illiberal democracies or dictatorships altogether in many places. So that I think it is a problem of liberalism, that this liberalism was erected on strong nation states and even strong national welfare-centered programs of labor standards, of Social Security, et cetera. But when those programs no longer can meet the tasks of a global economy, it raises the question how they can be addressed. And I think liberals have yet to devise coordinated solutions across national lines for these. All we have are the extra national security measures in groups like NATO, for example, but we don't have ways to pull together to help India and the U.S. in common address problems, or we don't have many tools beyond national borders, and we don't have liberal visions for how we should do that.
I thought that point about how national leaders can't necessarily, they don't have the tools to provide national solutions anymore was a really important insight. Just if I could ask you to speculate for a minute, presumably that problem is also going to plague these illiberal authoritarians in place now, and they're going to find that they too are unable to deliver whatever it is they have promised. Do you think maybe that puts a shelf life on some of these movements?
Well, we can hope so. I think it does suggest, and I think there's plenty of evidence for the standing parties, people, to be eroding whatever they are and wherever they are. Whatever the forms of political stability are kind of under threat, however they're formed. But that does leave the problem then of brute force being used to hold people in check. Brazil had an elected new leader, Bolsonaro, but then he stays in power with a lot of underhanded tactics. Yes, Orban and in both Hungary and even in Poland, some illiberal regimes have taken place, but once they're in place, then they often resort to new mechanisms to stay in power. So I don't know how confident we can be absent a more concerted thrust. And this is, I think, just as I think the period of the Cold War does show the capacity of democratic states to band together for common projects, and I think we have to kind of find those threads again. Just for example, and I don't even talk about this in the book, but clearly the liberal democracies have great systems of higher education, universities, and it might, but it might well be useful to pull together, a network of universities, across, whether it's South Korea, Japan, India, as well as U.S. and Europe, South America. These are centers of basically liberal engagement. And it's just one example. Lay worker organizations would be another, where we could forge stronger unities beyond national lines.
Is it possible some of those supranational organizations are better equipped to forge unity along those lines in the economic or intellectual spheres than they are in questions of national sovereignty? I can't just, I'm watching what's going on in Ukraine and wondering, what power exactly the West's democracies have through NATO to do much about it.
Yeah, I think that, Ukraine almost seems like a deja vu of the Cold War. And I think that fortunately, we have those deep set instincts of how to handle like Cold War bullies, and it seems like really the editorials or writers are trotting out a copy that they've had in the freezers for a while, and they can just pull it out, because that doesn't seem to be, to me, like the most demanding and I mean the most puzzling of problems. I mean, we're used to the need for deterrence in the case of big power bullies, and so I think that we're likely to ride this one out. I think it's more intractable are the issues of climate change, of disease, since the pandemic, of issues of resources, energy, that kind of don't track in customary ways.
While we're on the subject of bullies and old habits of how to deal with them, I think the book is in some ways wistful, if you don't mind me saying, for an era of liberal internationalism that also, as you point out now and also in the book, sort of bled into interventionism. And idealists on the left looked at our failure to stop whatever, the gassing of Kurds in Halabja or the Rwanda genocide, and drove us to these interventions in the Balkans to mixed success, and Iraq to much less success, among other places. Now, one reason I sometimes wonder whether progressives turned against liberal internationalism in the last 2 decades is that they concluded Iraq was sort of the obvious extension of this philosophy. Was it?
Well, of course, Iraq wasn't so much started by liberals as it was by as the Bushites, but it was followed up by, it had the support of
they were on a team,
liberal cloud like the Clintons, to be sure. But I think the problem goes back to for progressives, or I do call for a new progressive internationalism in the book, but the problem I think goes back to for progressives to the Vietnam War and what to do after, because Vietnam was the kind of the cold shot, the kind of the slap in the head to liberals about the whole post-war strategy that they'd adopted of liberal anti-communism and taking it to, extremes and paying a heavy price. And the result was that the Democratic Party not only split on foreign policy, but what I'd call the liberal progressives adopted a kind of anti-interventionist stance in general, especially against military intervention. And then came ultimately 9/11, and that seemed to demand, again, some kind of commitment beyond non-interventionism as a policy. And I think liberals have been struggling to come up with an alternative ever since, one that's, neither too hot nor too cold. But I think that the issue is that liberals in the aftermath of Vietnam haven't come up with an alternative formulation for a kind of positive, but largely non-military means. We've largely suspended the idea of foreign aid or development. That just has not been in the front of any of our foreign policy. And what does it mean to have an ally, especially in the third world? What does it mean if we're friends of another people? How do we actually help them? How do we create partnerships for progressive ends? I think those things still have there's even as so many of our issues, even domestically, have foreign roots and foreign connections. We still talk about them mostly as if they're domestic problems, and in fact, if we're going to resolve them, we have to deal with it in an international way.
Let me change the subject for just a moment. You write, fulsomely about the early labor Zionist project, and you think Israel's adolescence was overall a worthy endeavor, although you point out that liberals at the time there and also here in the U.S. failed to think much about what would happen to the 750,000 displaced Palestinians. Today, we're grappling with that failure and the descendants of those refugees numbering in the millions. I think I know you favor a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine, something that hasn't really advanced since 2001. As someone who studies political movements, this book has a great chapter on apartheid. I'm wondering what you think about BDS, the boycott, divestment, sanctions effort to punish Israel for occupying the West Bank, and other kind of radical means to steer Israel back to a more liberal path. What do you think of them both as like a moral enterprise and also a strategic one?
Well, I think BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions, draws on some of the themes from the civil rights movement or the anti-apartheid movement. But I think for the most part, it's rather crude and inappropriate in the analogies it draws. Not so much because Israel is not a worthy subject of concern or even active concern. And I think Israel does have human rights problems which should be concerns of liberals. But it has, but particularly BDS goes to the as the kind of radical edge of the Palestinian rights movement. BDS goes so far as to question the legitimacy of the Jewish state of Israel in its very formation, and calls for the right of return of all of those 3/4 million forced migrants. That's a grievance against Israel, but it's not a grievance that delegitimizes the entire state. I think that the Israel was a creation of a united, really the great powers, to combine with the people in the Yishuv in 1948 as a national, as a national liberation movement for besieged people, as a refugee state. The issues, comparing it to apartheid is a weak analogy, in the sense of I think that in the case of apartheid, you had a regime that was economically oppressing the majority of the people in the country. In the case of Israel, it's sort of the opposite. The people that they're oppressing want to get into the country. They want the jobs in Israel. It has to be a different set of solutions, or a different set of resolution. I think what is called for is a civil rights campaign, a nonviolent civil rights campaign in Israel and outside, to pressure the government in regards to the occupied territory in particular. And clearly there are major grievances there. But I think that the BDS movement doesn't respect history itself, or the rights of as still fragile and endangered people.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for that. Your scholarship is very focused on labor. I'm wondering if you could just talk for a few minutes about what you see as the state of the American worker in 2022. And I know your book is more focused on the relationships abroad, but it does seem like a very tough time domestically for the movement, with card check and right to work laws, and a lot of polarization in post-industrial states driving blue collar workers away from unions, which are sometimes seen as a proxy for the Democratic Party at the left. Is the labor movement here dead, or what's the status of it, and how does that kind of have interplay with the stuff you talk about in the book, the relationships abroad?
Well, it's certainly not dead, as the recent agitation at both Amazon and Starbucks suggests, and as clearly strong teacher unions have been in the forefront of the politics around the around COVID.
But in all three cases, facing very strong counter reactions.
Absolutely, and I'd say that the unions have been on the defensive for some decades, and really this goes back to one of the foreign policy problems I tried to address, namely that what I call the Bretton Woods boomerang, that the U.S., including the labor movement helping to lead the charge, pushed for this expansive world architecture of trade. And this was fine so long as the West, and the U.S., was exporting our products. But then when much of the manufacturing is being imported, and in our own capacity to for key elements of production are being outsourced, that those very open portals of trade have come back to haunt our own workforce, our own workers. And unfortunately not built in, while the Bretton Woods Agreement built in certain forms of security protections for currency, against currency manipulation, against loss of balance of payments. It didn't build in any protections for employment, or it didn't build in any protections for the whole loss of entire economic regions as production would shift, or as investment and capital, as capital shifted. So I think there needs to be, it was short-sighted at the time, but there needs to be a kind of effectively a new Bretton Woods spirit, or if not an agreement, that builds some protections for vital industries, or allows for some sort of baseline that stops a kind of rush to the bottom in terms of labor costs.
Can I ask whom you voted for in the 2020 Democratic primary?
Well, I was a Warren Sanders Democrat, and I toyed with both of them and ended up voting for Bernie. You
you point out that liberal prescriptions, quoting, liberal prescriptions prove imperfect and at best all too often ill-founded, if not blatantly hypocritical, for other countries' problems abroad. And you also say liberals prove themselves, if not clueless, then largely ineffective in providing solutions that work. At the same time, I think there's a sort of lament here in the book that liberals have given up any attempt, as you put it, to sway others to our values or long-term goals. I guess I'm wondering, given the mixed record that you cite, and also all the ways the world has changed since the Cold War, whom do you think in 2022 would listen to liberal evangelism?
Well, I think that liberal evangelism is not just an empty set of arid principles, but it has to be tied to programs of empowerment, whether that's, as in the case of the anti-apartheid movement, it was empowerment, it was grassroots organizing that pushed the Congress to do its bidding. I think that the liberal message, a liberal message today has to speak to people's sense of basic fairness, of relations among the diversity of our people. It has to address the problems of our own kind of internal, if not apartheid, our own kind of suppressed population of workforce that can't come out of the shadows because it's undocumented. So I think that we have a basic citizenship problem in this country still with our undocumented population. The liberal values of voice, representation, of rights, and empowerment from the bottom up are still, I think, very, very much on the agenda.
It's a tall order. I mean, to be the example, we need to solve these very intractable structural national problems, which themselves, as you point out, are contingent on international globalized trends. I'm just wondering, how would you describe your disposition? Are you an optimist? Do you think the liberal project of fighting for economic abundance and social welfare can someday be achieved? Or are you, what's your sort of view?
It depends which day, Adam. It's hard to be, having lived now in DC for the last 5 years, it's hard to be terribly optimistic. But I do think, if we look around at some trends of in gathering in places like Germany, the return of more of a social democratic government, I think the liberal even in this country as well, I think liberalism has its work boots on now. In this country, if you look at the progressives, they don't have the quite the clout to get their programs through. But what they're pushing, even in the Congress now, is a much more thorough program of empowerment, of equity, than was the case 20 years ago. And I think similarly in places of our allies in Germany, for example, there are programs afoot for how to deal with climate change and jobs, notions of like the Green New Deal and their equivalents that are attempts to really transform, adapt older values to newer challenges.
In some ways, to me, it's a very confusing moment where the Overton window here has shifted much closer in some ways to what those liberals were at first arguing for, the New Dealers and all that, at the same time as the traditions of democracy and pluralism are in terrible peril all over the planet. But anyway, this has been a really interesting chat. I want to open it up. We have all these great questions from the audience, and I'm going to see if I can figure out how to summon them here. So I'm going to indicate that I am answering this live. Here's a question from an anonymous attendee. Do you think the liberal wing of the Democratic Party / the Biden administration will embrace the successful Abraham Accords and continue to pursue them?
I think it is the Abraham Accords, of course, is the opening that in the Trump era took to help for Israel and the UAE and a couple of the other Emirates to open up connections with Israel. I think Biden will allow those to develop. I think they're very limited in their scope and capacity. The one good thing that's come of those accords is highlighted in a recent column on issues of water rights. I think the longer term solutions are supranational in the Middle East, just as they are between the U.S. and Central America. And there are attempts now to combine Palestinian, Israeli, and some of the states, including the Emiratis, to come up with water and energy solutions at the regional level. I think that would be a positive thing. I think otherwise, the Abraham Accords were an attempt to avoid dealing with the Palestinian question in Israel, and I don't think that begins to address the problems of the region.
Here's a question from Barry Yarozolsky. So he asks, how would you assess the role of liberalism in the opening of economic links to China and the consequences of what was set in motion under President Clinton?
That's a good question, I think, in the sense that it addresses really the paradox or the internal dilemmas of the liberal opening, the liberal in the sense of open markets, liberal in the classic sense of what happened with ultimately with the Bretton Woods model. I think that how I would address it is to acknowledge that the Chinese miracle of production and helping to solve the food crisis in its own country was a tremendous accomplishment in terms of GDP, but it came at real costs, some cost in China itself and some to the world at large, including basically eroding standards of wages and living standards in the West, and I think in that sense it was heedless of some of its important consequences.
Here's a question from Jeff Berner. How much of the failure of liberal policy in the post-World War II era may be due to the weakening of statecraft and soft power projection and turning over foreign policy primarily to the U.S. military, which is evident in considering both the rebuild of Iraq and the occupation of Afghanistan as primarily military endeavors?
I think that's an excellent insight. When we think of American presence abroad, I mean, we once thought of things like the Marshall Plan or even the Alliance for Progress, for example. And now the equivalents are hundreds of American bases abroad, and no equivalent social or economic plan that I can think of. So that I think that I guess the questioner was saying, has there been an erosion of soft power? And I think that's exactly true, and that we've relied way too heavily on, on military intervention. And this is combined with, I think, a weakness in our way of thinking about foreign policy, is that we so much, if you turn on the cable news, against the foreign policy, it's always the men, often in uniform, or not, if not in uniform, then they're men from the security, these think tanks and security agencies. It's all security questions or military framed, not in terms of what are the needs of people around the world, and how can America help address them. So there's very little attention to the themes of education, of skill development, of new industries, or how we can actually harness strengths of people around the world in a positive way, as opposed to seeing everyone else as a threat.
I'm persuaded by that. J Rock asks, how do you think we can restore the political power of countries to control domestic distribution of wealth? Does international free trade preclude this?
I think international free trade taken to extreme does. I mean, international trade certainly does not. It's still very important. But I do think there have been new ideas for like an international finance or transaction tax for all, all stock market investments. I think there are ways that the trade, which is now so much of international capital is tied to the finance industry, needs to be lassoed back into use for more productive purposes. And I think that can be done partially through a global tax, but it needs to be done at an international level, because otherwise, just as we have the problem in states of business fleeing to the least tax state or the least unionized state, there's this tendency abroad to rush to the least regulated states, and so I think that the move towards a universal tax is a good idea.
Here's a question from Mitchell Case. Do you think the modern world system, international capitalism and the financial system, constrains Russia and or Chinese adventurism, say in the Ukraine or with cyber meddling? Does their joining and participating in those systems actually constrain them?
Well, I suppose we'll see. I do think the speculation is that ultimately Putin does not want to go too far, and certainly his cronies do not want to go too far in tearing down the system which has benefited them so much financially. But how much it will operate to restrain their appetites is a good question. I do think that it's the appeal of the productive side of the world economy is a constraint on the the more totalitarian or authoritarian tendencies of both Russia and China.
Just seems to me a little bit like it has been hard to show a direct causal relationship between admonishments from those international organizations and direct, inhibitions shown in Russia or China. It doesn't seem to have worked that much to me. I guess it depends.
It seems to me that the two are a bit different. That the Chinese threat, yes, China is a bully, especially in its internally towards its minorities and in its immediate region, which is Hong Kong, Taiwan, but otherwise is not overstepping anybody's boundaries. It's not engaged in military adventurism. I think its threat is more economic. And we help build them up, and we need to create an architecture in which they're a player, but a fair player, abiding by fair rules. Russia, on the other hand, is a little bit different, it seems to me, is not operating as an international economic power, but it is a kind of revanchist military power, kind of a thrashing dinosaur. A little, so I think the threat's a little different.
Answering in Russia's case also, I think a lot to domestic politics. Here's a question: what would, while we're on the topic of Russia and Ukraine, what, we heard your a suggestion of your thoughts. I think that maybe a military intervention to protect Ukraine is not that wise or sound. But this questioner asks, what would a viable liberal foreign policy prescribe for Ukraine?
Well, here I don't think. I mean, I think if we step back, we can ask. We could second guess, from a liberal point of view, or liberal progressive point of view, we could second guess the post Gorbachev collapse of the Soviet Union years of quick attempt to fence Russia in with NATO and American missiles in Eastern Europe, and basically a hostile approach from the beginning, rather than a more cooperative approach towards the Russians and their economy. But that's water under under the bridge. I think I wouldn't really second guess. I mean, I really wouldn't criticize what I see Biden doing now, that is attempting to rally European support for holding the line on Russia, and even threatening multiple ways to get back at any territorial transgressions. So I'm, including supporting, an insurgency for that matter. I mean, where's the CIA when we need it?
The all-powerful CIA.
Right.
To that point, it seems like, one thing a liberal would always need to understand is that you do the liberal things up to the point where they fail, and you have just exhausted what you can do, and sometimes the outcomes aren't what you want them to be, but short of military intervention. Someone asks, I would love to hear your thoughts about how the current administration can address the current political divisions in the U.S. This seems particularly urgent when so many people share an alarming support for a civil war in the U.S. What types of interventions have other countries have attempted to implement in order to minimize the threat of an actual civil war?
That's a good question. I know there's a lot of talk about the formula for civil war, and how we show some of the flashing yellow lights or red, or tripwires along that path. I'm a little skeptical of that line of reasoning, in the sense that I see that in terms of civil war, that the don't think we're facing the threat of a military coup in this country. And short of that, who's going to organize the forces of civil war? I think the problems are more in our political system. Are we losing our democracy through legal means? And I think we could hollow out our democracy by leaving its institutions formally in place, but without the confidence that they're being honored in spirit. As far as how to reckon with that, I think it's a real question of why it seems that well, on a couple of fronts. Obviously, there's the structural problem of lack of democracy through the Electoral College and through the minority control of the Senate, through control of states that do not have, basically the power is in the hands of a minority, whether it's states with small populations who ultimately outvote the places where the majority lives in the country, whether it's the Supreme Court that can potentially undermine political consensus reached through more democratic means. There are various real challenges to our democracy. Each of those has to be addressed, I think, with a specific antidote. In my view, the Supreme Court, it is time to, in one way or another, roll back the power of the court to overturn legislated action. And I've argued in one place that Congress could vote to make the court decide, instead of by a super majority, that is a 7-2 decision, as opposed to allow for 5-4 decisions to override legislation. I think there's also ideas of court packing, but none of those can happen with the current 50-50 U.S. Senate. So I'm not optimistic about those structural changes. I do think I think we have a problem of political mobilization that liberals need to address by getting involved in local governments and wherever they live. Because why is it that we seem to think that there's always this, even if it's not really a full majority, that there's such a numerous opposition that lives in its own alternative communicative silo, and doesn't seem to listen to what seems so obvious in terms of the pandemic, or seems so obvious in terms of basic economic or basic rights issues. I think something has broken down in the way we communicate with each other, and probably we need to, liberals need to lose their sense of fear of the other and get out and talk to people. I don't think that the small towns of America, or the outside the Beltway and the coastal states are really as hostile as they seem when you just look at the media presentation, or the political conglomerates. So I think we need our own grassroots initiatives.
You just corrected yourself mid-sentence from "we need to get out and talk to these people" to "liberals need to get out," and I'm wondering if there's some significance to that. Or do you no longer consider yourself a liberal?
Oh, no, I consider myself a left liberal, for sure.
I was interested to hear you talk about, court packing, or a 7-2 threshold for overturning precedents, which, you would think a liberal position would be to uphold norms and traditions and sort of respect processes. And obviously those are sort of last resort gambits that you are hardly alone among liberals in looking at, but it's a striking departure from maybe what you would think of as traditional liberalism. Do you agree with that?
That's interesting. I think that from one point of view, I can definitely see why you might say that. But if you're a labor historian like me, and you've been following the labor issues over time, you would see that the Supreme Court, really going back to the beginnings of the 20th century, has has been a drag on worker rights. Going back to overturning the ability of states to have minimum wage laws, up through Citizens United, or empowering corporations with the rights of political democracy. Just a continual flow of decisions that from the Supreme Court, with some exceptions, but with a continual flow, which seems to represent the economic interest of an elite versus the majority. And I think that, where, as in, Roe was decided by 7-2, was backed by a 7-2 majority. The Brown v. Board was a unanimous verdict. There are places where the Supreme Court usefully has intervened for individual rights, but so often it's been effectively a relative drag on the democratic forces, and today it represents a real threat on so many fronts.
Well, great minds think alike. You'll be interested to learn that at Outlook a couple of years ago, I ran a cover story about how the Supreme Court had been the greatest impediment to worker rights in the country, far more than any other popular forces or financial ones. Here's an interesting question. Is your position that anti-communism motivated the missionary view, or was anti-communism used to try to sell missionary goals? An analogy might seem to be counterterrorism, where the development community was quick to jump on the CT bandwagon to promote its own missionary goal, the idea that underdeveloped and corrupt countries are prone to generate terrorists. Where's the chicken and the egg here?
Yeah, chicken and the egg. Well, anti-communism, I think, played a different role in different places. I think in a place like India that I look at in one chapter, people like Galbraith and Bowles were pushing for a really dynamic program of economic aid and even in land reform, but they came up against the Vietnam War itself, the cost of guns versus butter, and the India itself wanted to stay neutral in the Cold War at that time, and U.S. leadership, LBJ in particular, just wouldn't have it, and so that was a case where the liberal mission of attempting to unite kind of domestic version of liberalism with the foreign policy of liberalism was checkmated by the military wing of American foreign policy. That's not always the case. I think you could say that the mission of anti-communism helped to create the Marshall Plan in the first place, which was a mission of recovery and development in Europe. So it didn't always work in a singular direction. I suggest in my chapter on Central America that it generally operated, the mission of anti-communism generally operated to forestall more progressive efforts at empowerment, and pushing back against peasant movements, against worker movements, and then with the idea that they could be subversive, and that led to most of these movements of from the ground up to support Castro and to move towards to be more sympathetic to communism as the one alternative. But there was an exception that I point to in the case of Costa Rica, where a more humane example of the mission supported a government of a remarkable social democracy, a welfare state in Costa Rica that to this day produced Nobel Prize winners and Nobel Prize winner for peace, and has been a remarkably buoyant, positive economy. So I think that communism, this goes back to the question, was provided one, in some cases, took the form of a kind of vicious military response, and in other forms took a rather creative attempt to create alternative, non-authoritarian, but still democratic and progressive alternative policy directions.
Speaking of some of those matters, occupying Afghanistan was hardly a liberal foreign policy initiative, somebody asks, but can the recent pullout be considered a loss for liberal world order nevertheless?
That's a good question. I think it points to the thinness of the notion of the liberal world order, unfortunately, that a liberal world order that's just defined by, and which it often is just defined by the states that abide by kind of basic rules of international political economy and allow for investment, too often are only addressing the needs of a really small segment of the population. And in the case of Afghanistan, you know, I think this is unlike the case of India. In the case of Afghanistan, it was like, I think especially once we had cleared out Al-Qaeda, there was really not a clear mission as to what we were there for. And there was a smattering of development. Yes, some schools were set up, you know, in the capital city, but there was no, this was not a coordinated program. And I think the retreat was inevitable. It was probably, again, a case where the U.S. should have not made the investment that it did in the first place.
There are a lot of questions about Israel here. One of them I see accuses me of asking a biased question when I was curious about BDS. Just to be clear, that's not because I support it, but because I think the comparison that its proponents make to anti-apartheid is interesting and relevant to Leon Fink's work. Here is a question from somebody who says, what are your thoughts about the hyper-focus on Israel, the isolating and vilifying of the most liberal democratic country in the Middle East while ignoring real human rights atrocities in other countries?
Well, I would, I'm sympathetic to that question if you're talking about the attempt to delegitimize Israel entirely, because I would come back and say, well, then which of the other Arab countries are more legitimate, or what other countries around the world are really more legitimate? But once we take it away from those kind of polemics arguments, then I do think there is a right to question Israel by Americans and liberals, and partly because we've been key allies with Israel and therefore should have the right to counsel or to engage them, and partly not just as allies. They have, along with Egypt, have been our biggest recipients of aid now for years. So I think the U.S. has supported Israel through many adverse attacks from the outside for decades. And in the case of the Palestinians, beginning in the 1970s, Jimmy Carter, who was trying to create a post-Vietnam progressive foreign policy, it was his administration with Cy Vance and Andrew Young that attempted to, and ultimately in Camp David, to bring Arabs and Israelis together, but also to create an opening for some treatment of the Palestinian issue, and ultimately, you know, a homeland for the Palestinians, and then ultimately the idea of a two-state solution. And I don't think it's going too far to criticize Israel for its lack of honesty or integrity in dealing with the question of a Palestinian state. It's really, no Israeli government has really supported it. It was really a U.S. initiative and a U.S. venture held up with illusion. So I may have given the impression that I was a big two-state supporter, but I think it's largely been well, I think it's a largely empty dream at this point. I don't think there's a viable second state there, but I think it does raise the question of the need for some forms of shared sovereignty. That can't be done overnight, but the problems in the region are beyond national. I don't think that Israel can't be. It's not going to close its tents, but I think it is responsible for this yawning problem now over a half century of occupied territory, and it has to come up with a. I think it needs to come up. It needs to come up with some project for the empowerment of Palestinians and moving towards citizenship, either in Israel itself or in some shared sovereignty or in a second state.
Here's a question from the right side. We have to air Tim Batchelor. He asks, are you familiar with the 2019 work from Stephen Melania and George Yeager at the Manhattan Institute, advancing that blue states, liberal by nature, not only have higher taxes, but also lower services?
Mm-hmm. Well, very clever Manhattan Institute. I'm not too surprised. And I'm not totally, again, I'm not really addressing that issue in my work, but it does address my politics, I guess. So I would say that without getting into a tit for tat, that in general, the blue states, as does the Scandinavian states, as does Germany, have higher, better educational programs, better welfare systems than the red states. And yes, their taxes tend to be higher. And you could, in any specific instance, you could point to whether the states are well or poorly administered, whether it's wasteful or productive bureaucracies. And I don't quarrel that the costs are higher, but I would argue that in general, I would argue that a mixed economy works better than moving towards a low tax, anti-union, just trickle down economic systems.
Here's a great power question from Louisa. It says there are some Chinese economists who say amongst themselves that they believe the major power rivalry between China and the US will come out in their favor. Their consensus is that the US had to police the world without the benefit of being able to tax corporations worldwide to recoup their costs. So the model is not sustainable long-term. They also take comfort from the fact that their government need not fulfill the many welfare obligations to the Chinese people, which is not an option to liberal democracies such as the US. Would you be interested in reassessing your belief that the breakdown in this relationship is primarily a communications problem?
The breakdown in the relationship, which relationship, please?
I assume the questioner is referring to the bilateral U.S.-Chinese relationship.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the questioner points to important structural differences. I don't think China is as entirely heedless of the welfare of its citizens. It's basically a dictatorship, but it's balanced, on meeting the basic needs of a huge population, and it's sensitive, I think, to issues of unemployment, issues of starvation. It's had to address those, and it continues to have to address those. So it's not utterly untethered to the world of the welfare of its citizenry. And I think that while the questioner makes some good points about the lack of, in other words, I don't think that the main, I think we could, it's worth looking at the structural problems confronting the two systems, China and the US, but they're also connected by, an important source of mutual interest. Trade has been one, which has been crucial really to both, even if those terms need to be adjusted, in my view, need to be renegotiated, in my view. But that's an important bond and of common self-interest. And I would say that they both have shown enough realism about issues of basic human survival, about energy and about climate and about health. Now we can question, the secrecy of the Chinese in relation to the COVID-19. That's fine, but I don't think we can question the degree of sophistication of the Chinese systems of health and public health. So I think, these are two systems that have definitely arenas of conflict where the US and liberal concern for human rights and democratic empowerment provides a strong basis of justifiable critique. And at the same time, we can hardly lord it over the Chinese, as our success in dealing with our own basic problems has yet to be fully demonstrated.
I would just concur as somebody who covered China. I think the CCP is extremely sensitive about discontent and any stirrings of resentment from the people they govern, or else you wouldn't see such drastic and dramatic efforts to curtail speech and things that they say undermine national cohesion. And they wouldn't go to such lengths sending people to prison and cutting them off from the internet and all the other things they do to protect what they believe is a sort of national unity, if they didn't already worry quite a bit about what their citizenry thought.
Exactly.
Here, let's see, coming back to Israel for a moment, from Chelsea Blink. Given the current answer about how a two-state solution is no longer viable, what can and should the Biden administration and Congress be doing now to move toward a one-state solution that's a real improvement over the status quo?
Here, I think being specific about areas of the most obvious human rights grievance are worth pursuing, such as when Israel denies people the defense of homes in East Jerusalem, or you basically denies access to even peaceful demonstrations by Palestinians on either side of the Green Line. I think there are real transgressions that the Israeli government has taken that need to be protested. But in terms of a more systemic outcome, I think it's really hard to say, except that I do think that there should be ultimate cost for Israel, not themselves coming up with a guidepost or a timeline for Palestinian rights of citizenship. Now, I think that if, forget BDS, if there were a real civil rights movement that followed the King model or the Gandhian model of massive nonviolent protest, I think a lot of Americans would support that. A lot of American liberals would support that. If its aims were for equal rights and participation in a common state, perhaps some kind of binational state, or if they preferred an end of their own state. Israel has been sympathetic to neither of those so far. And if there were a civil rights movement that manifested itself, I think it would gather support. I don't think otherwise that the U.S. is in a position, as you know, I think the questioner is right. An earlier questioner is right. While the U.S. has reason to be concerned with Israel, it doesn't have the right to bully Israel like it's our pet, it's our little pet in the Middle East either, because it's not. And I think you know, Israel will have to find its own way of dealing with this massive problem. I think that I would hesitate to apply, you know, simple formulas to Israel that I think are often misused.
I think your political analysis of what would be saleable here in terms of the civil rights movement there is right. But I suspect what a Palestinian or a Palestinian activist would say is that the Israeli government and the administration of Area C and the West Bank has made it very, very difficult to organize nonviolent protests and large gatherings of people in general. It made it, I think they would argue, has made it essentially impossible.
I think that's fair enough, and at the same time, I don't think we can ignore the fact that Israel continues to respond to threats that are generated in really an exterminationist determined Iran towards Israel, in creating Hezbollah and setting rockets towards Israel. This is not the civil rights movement that we imagine or are sympathetic with. And I think Israel's contending with both. It uses the Iranian and terrorist threat, obviously, to ignore the civil rights threat. And at the same time, we have to, I think, demand or call on the Palestinians to conduct, you know, and their allies to conduct their campaign with respect for basic norms.
We are winding down on time. Here is an important topic from Dora that I don't think we've really dealt with, which is, what is the role of immigrants and immigration in the turn away from liberalism?
I think that's an excellent question. That could be the focus of a whole other program. I think on the one hand, one of the two major respects, one, immigration creates a kind of scapegoat, an easy scapegoat, that our problems are external. They have to do with the people crossing our borders, and not, you know, that the problem of low wages, the problem of loss of good paying jobs is because they're taking the jobs, or that they are creating our crime problems, et cetera, the classic scapegoat theory. And on the other hand, at the same time, immigration is an issue because so much of our real economy is on the backs of low-wage immigrant workers who don't have the rights to enfranchisement as workers, who are threatened with arbitrary loss of jobs if they come forward, because they're not huge industries. Our landscaping, lots of construction, lots of low-wage production are really on the shoulders of undocumented people. So in that respect, our labor problem is an immigration problem, and vice versa. And and I think enfranchising, bringing the how many millions, 15 plus millions of the undocumented, would be one of the best things we could do for our democracy.
For our final question, I will call upon Dale Fink, who asks, do you lump together as liberals those strata who want to fundamentally maintain the international and domestic corporate capitalist order, but, you know, with fair taxes, fewer racial, gender, and other barriers, and generally more compassion for humankind, and also those who want to challenge corporate hegemony and subject them to more democratic and labor-oriented norms? It's a taxonomy question to end us up. Are all those people liberals?
I don't know. must be a smart guy if his name is Dale Fink. I'm not sure, but I would say that I am, for purposes here, largely lumping the two groups together. Not so much the liberals who just support. I'm focusing on the new liberals, for example, for the most part, who had two sources of origin: the New Deal in the 30s, who supported the policies of Franklin Roosevelt and kind of Social Security and labor rights, and also then the new liberals of the post-Vietnam era, who were against arbitrary armed interventions abroad, and who were much more sensitive, to go back to one of Adam's questions, the issues of identity, whether it's race or gender or sexual identity. I think both of those come under my definition of today's liberals.
This was tremendously fascinating. Thank you, Leon, and also to all those Columbia Harvard people who have run our government in perpetuity. Apparently, the organizers are going to send out a link to this talk tomorrow. It was recorded, and also a link to the book, Undoing the Liberal World Order. Buy it, lift Professor Fink's Amazon ranking so he can fight the monopolists that way. And I'm also instructed to mention, so in 24 hours, this will be processed and a link to the talk will be sent out. Thanks so much to everyone for coming, and especially Leon for doing this with me. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you, Adam. I much enjoyed it. Yeah, good.
Stay warm, everybody.